September 5, 1944. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt returned to the Eastern High Command headquarters for the first time in 2 months. In January, he had been relieved of command after telling Hitler's staff that the situation in Normandy was hopeless and recommending that they seek peace. Now, Hitler was summoning him back, a stark reminder of how dire the situation had become. General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff for all German forces in the East, awaited him with maps spread across the table. The maps told a story of near catastrophe. The Allied forces had shattered German defenses in Normandy 6 weeks prior, and now they were advancing through France faster than anyone had anticipated. Blumentritt pointed to the northern sector. The American Third Army, commanded by General George Patton, had already covered more than 400 kilometers. The spearhead of his forces was less than 100 kilometers from the German border, with scarcely any German units standing in the way. Von Rundstedt studied the map and asked the question he already knew the answer to. How could they stop him? Blumentritt's response was blunt. Nothing. At the outset of September 1944, the German military situation was more precarious than most historians realize. This was not a simple retreat, it was the near-total collapse of German combat power in the West. To understand the gravity, we must consider what von Rundstedt and Blumentritt faced on September 5. Between Patton's position and the German border, there was not a single fully operational German division. None. The units that had fought in France were either destroyed, shattered, or fleeing eastward in disarray. Heavy weapons had been abandoned, communications disrupted, and organized command structures had largely evaporated. The famous Siegfried Line fortifications in the east, once Germany's defensive backbone, had been neutralized over the summer, leaving bunkers and pillboxes empty and unmanned. The soldiers remaining were incapable of coordinated defense. Infantry could perhaps hold ground temporarily, but they could not stop armored spearheads. Panzer units were depleted or in the process of reforming far behind the lines. Supplies were scarce, artillery support minimal, and radio communications unreliable. Even a fully capable division would have struggled against Patton's momentum, but the reality was far worse. German divisions were under strength, poorly equipped, and scattered. Reserves, the lifeblood of any defense, were essentially non-existent. By September 1, there were no strategic armored reserves capable of countering the Third Army between the English Channel and Switzerland. Any attempt to halt Patton's advance through direct military confrontation was impossible. Von Rundstedt and his staff were acutely aware that their forces lacked the capacity to repel the American juggernaut. They understood that, for the first time since the German counteroffensives in Normandy, victory was not just unlikely, it was militarily impossible. Yet, something unexpected happened. After days of relentless pursuit, the Third Army's advance began to slow, then almost halted. The rapid, sweeping movements that had brought them hundreds of kilometers in a matter of weeks now ground to a frustrating stop. German commanders, intercepting Allied radio traffic, reported shortages of fuel and logistical constraints within Patton's ranks. Tanks could not be fully deployed, mechanized columns stalled, supply convoys lagged behind the front. Blumentritt later recalled that German officers initially assumed this pause was a feint or a deliberate tactic to deceive them, but as the days passed, it became clear that it was genuine. The American advance had been arrested not by German resistance but by logistical necessity. Von Rundstedt's anxiety was palpable. For the first time in months, German officers allowed themselves a cautious sense of relief. The army that had been on the brink of collapse suddenly had time to regroup, to reorganize, and to reinforce positions. Infantry that had fled was rounded up, weapons were redistributed, defensive lines were slowly reconstituted. In the coming weeks, Germany would use this breathing room to rebuild its defenses, restore armored divisions, and fortify positions along the Siegfried Line. What could have been a catastrophic breach at the Rhine in September 1944 was temporarily prevented, not by skill or superior planning, but by the limitations of the advancing army itself. The consequences were profound. Patton, poised for what could have been a decisive strike into the heart of Germany, was delayed by circumstances beyond his control. German commanders, including von Rundstedt, Blumentritt, and Westphal, later testified that without this pause, the Third Army would have reached the Rhine in mid-September, and the collapse of German forces could have precipitated the end of the war months earlier. Instead, the time bought by this logistical pause allowed Germany to prepare for later operations, including the infamous Ardennes offensive, giving the German army a temporary, albeit ultimately doomed, resurgence. In the chaos of early September 1944, one thing became clear. The war's trajectory was not solely determined by tactical brilliance or battlefield heroics. Logistics, timing, and chance played roles as decisive as any general strategy. Patton's Third Army had the power, the speed, and the momentum to potentially end the war in Western Europe, yet fate and supply shortages intervened. The German commanders, witnessing what they later described as miraculous reprieve, would spend months exploiting this unexpected gift, reshaping the battlefield and prolonging the conflict in ways that few contemporaries could have imagined. With the temporary halt of Patton's advance, German commanders seized the opportunity to rebuild what had been lost. The remnants of shattered divisions were gathered, refitted, and sent back to the front. Training battalions, previously held in Germany, were rushed forward, alongside Luftwaffe personnel and even naval troops repurposed for ground combat. Defensive positions along the Siegfried Line, once empty concrete shells, were restored into functional fortifications. Mines were laid, artillery positioned, and communications rebuilt. By the end of September 1944, the German army had transformed empty, shattered sectors into prepared defensive zones capable of withstanding assaults. The rebuilding process was a Herculean task. Tanks destroyed in Normandy were replaced with new Panzers, assembled and delivered to the front. Infantry units were reformed from a mix of veterans, young recruits, and wounded soldiers returning from hospitals. Artillery units were restored to full strength, while engineers repaired roads and bridges vital for movement and supply. The German High Command coordinated these efforts meticulously, knowing that time was now their most valuable asset. Yet, despite this extraordinary recovery, the situation remained precarious. The Third Army still posed a formidable threat. Patton's forces, though slowed by fuel shortages, were not defeated. The Allies retained air superiority, overwhelming firepower, and the ability to mass forces rapidly. Any German misstep could once again expose them to collapse. The pressure on commanders like von Rundstedt and Blumentritt was immense. Every decision, every movement, carried the weight of the Reich's survival. The pause in Patton's advance had another significant effect. It allowed German planners to conceive the Ardennes offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. Months of preparation, including stockpiling fuel, moving armored divisions into hidden positions, and concentrating artillery, were made possible by those crucial September weeks. Without the unplanned halt of the Third Army, such a bold operation would have been impossible. Germany, though already in decline, had bought a temporary window to strike back and regain some initiative on the Western Front. In the American camp, frustration grew as Patton's momentum stalled. Officers and troops who had been moving at a breakneck pace suddenly faced inactivity, forced to consolidate positions and wait for logistics to catch up. For soldiers used to rapid advances, the lull was surreal. Fields of battle that had been vibrant with motion now fell silent, the only sound coming from distant artillery and the occasional reconnaissance flight. The pause underscored a critical lesson of warfare. Even the most powerful and well-led forces are subject to the limitations of supply and infrastructure. For the Germans, a halt was nothing short of miraculous. Experienced officers described the period as a miracle of the East, using terminology that reflected their disbelief at being spared from immediate destruction. Von Rundstedt later wrote that the temporary cessation of American advance saved Germany from an operational collapse that would have been irreversible in September 1944. Blumentritt echoed these sentiments, emphasizing that the Third Army's pause, dictated by fuel shortages rather than German action, allowed them to regroup, reorganize, and prepare for the battles that would follow in the winter months. By early October, the German army had achieved a remarkable transformation. The Siegfried Line was functional once more, armored divisions were ready to respond, and the High Command had established operational reserves. German forces were not invincible, but the catastrophic collapse of September had been averted. Patton's Third Army remained a powerful threat, but the battlefield had shifted from an open race through France to a more deliberate, attritional struggle. This period demonstrated the fragile balance between opportunity and disaster in warfare. Had Patton's advance continued uninterrupted, the German army might have been crushed west of the Rhine, potentially ending the war months earlier. Instead, logistical constraints gave Germany a fleeting chance to stabilize, prolonging the conflict and shaping the operational landscape for the late 1944 campaigns. The decisions, delays, and chance events of those weeks would resonate across history, illustrating the unpredictable interplay of strategy, timing, and circumstance in the theater of war. As October progressed, the temporary stabilization of the German lines allowed the Wehrmacht to rebuild not only physically but psychologically. Commanders and soldiers, once demoralized by rapid defeats in France, regained a sense of purpose. Orders were clearer, supply lines cautiously restored, and units once considered shattered were reorganized into coherent formations. The Ardennes, heavily forested and difficult terrain, became a natural staging ground for German preparations. High Command understood that the coming winter could favor defensive operations if they timed their counterattacks correctly. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army faced the challenges of extended supply lines. The pace of the advance had outstripped logistics, leaving fuel, ammunition, and spare parts lagging behind. The soldiers, accustomed to relentless forward motion, now contended with frustration, fatigue, and the uncertainty of a pause that seemed indefinite. Engineers worked around the clock to repair roads damaged by retreating German forces and to maintain bridges essential for armored movements. Even with these efforts, forward momentum was limited. Every day of delay, while frustrating, allowed German forces to fortify positions that had been previously empty. The High Command in Germany recognized the opportunity these weeks afforded them. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, General Blumentritt, and other senior officers meticulously reviewed the placement of armored and infantry divisions, anticipating the logistical difficulties that the Allies would continue to face. Panzer divisions, though not at full strength, were strategically positioned to maximize their effectiveness in defensive and counteroffensive operations. Supply depots were camouflaged, and artillery batteries were distributed to cover critical avenues of advance. Every decision reflected the understanding that the next engagement would demand precise coordination and resource allocation. In the American view, intelligence reports began to notice the subtle shift. Reconnaissance flights and intercepted communications hinted at renewed German activity. Units previously thought neutralized were regrouping, and defensive positions along the Siegfried Line were showing signs of fortification. Analysts on the Allied side began to warn of the potential for a concentrated German counterattack in the Ardennes region. The Third Army, still under Patton's dynamic leadership, was powerful, but constrained operational plans had to adjust to these new realities. By mid-November, the German army had executed an extraordinary transformation. Within just over 2 months, divisions that had been shattered and scattered in the wake of Normandy were now capable of coordinated action. Artillery was resighted, engineers had constructed defensive positions, and armored units were ready for deployment. The pause of the Third Army had inadvertently provided the Germans with the time to stage the ambitious winter offensive that would soon shock the Allies. The Ardennes offensive, later immortalized as the Battle of the Bulge. German commanders later reflected that without the temporary cessation of Patton's advance, such an operation would have been impossible. The logistical and operational windows they had exploited were created not by cunning German planning alone, but by circumstance. An American army halted by fuel shortages at the precise moment when German collapse seemed imminent. In retrospect, it became clear that September and October 1944 were a turning point. A period when the outcome of the Western Front hung in delicate balance, influenced as much by chance and logistics as by strategy and bravery. For the Allied forces, the lessons were stark. Speed, momentum, and overwhelming force could dominate an enemy, but only if the logistical backbone supported it. Patton's halted advance underscored the vital importance of supply chains, fuel management, and the integration of engineering and logistics into operational planning. Even the most audacious and aggressive commanders could find themselves constrained by the very limits of their resources. On the German side, the period was a study in resilience under extreme pressure. Experienced officers used every available asset, old veterans, new recruits, damaged equipment, to reconstruct a fighting force capable of defending key terrain. Coordination between divisions, the Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine personnel reassigned to land combat exemplified the adaptability of a military facing existential collapse. Every bunker repaired, every tank refitted, and every minefield laid was a testament to the skill and determination of commanders who refused to accept immediate defeat. By November, the Third Army's advance had effectively shifted from rapid movement to methodical attrition. The war was no longer the swift chase across France, it was now a grueling, systematic push against prepared defenses. Casualties mounted more slowly, progress was measured in kilometers rather than dozens of miles per day, and the psychological landscape had changed. American soldiers, once riding the wave of invincibility, now faced an enemy that had been given precious weeks to prepare, a pause that would have profound consequences in the battles to come. December 1944 marked a turning point for the European theater of World War II, not because of an overwhelming new Allied offensive, but due to the consequences of decisions and pauses that had taken place months earlier. The German forces, battered in the summer and early autumn, had used the critical weeks of September to regroup, rearm, and reorganize, creating the foundation for one of the last desperate gambits of the war, the Ardennes counteroffensive, later immortalized as the Battle of the Bulge. This operation was not improvised, it was meticulously planned over months, with German commanders moving reserves, consolidating panzer divisions, restocking artillery, and preparing fortified positions along the Allies' weak points. The pause that Patton's Third Army had taken earlier in September had provided exactly the time the Germans needed to construct a renewed defensive and offensive capability. Patton's army, previously advancing at a staggering pace, had been slowed not by German tactical brilliance, but by logistical constraints, fuel shortages, stretched supply lines, and the natural limits of operational sustainability. The Third Army, which had been moving more than 30 kilometers per day in early September, now faced a starkly different reality. The Siegfried Line, long thought to be neutralized and impenetrable, had been repaired, reinforced, and fully manned by well-trained German troops, making it a formidable barrier. Where once the American forces had moved through open territory with minimal resistance, every kilometer now had to be fought for, each advance exacting a heavy cost in men, material, and morale. The German military leadership, including figures like Field Marshal von Rundstedt, General Blumentritt, and General Westphal, had worked tirelessly to restore their units. Divisions that had been shattered in Normandy were reconstituted, reorganized, and trained to hold positions in counterattack. Panzer units, previously decimated, were rebuilt with newly produced tanks, crews trained in Germany, and combined with infantry and artillery to form balanced, functional fighting forces. By late November, German forces had established 30 reinforced divisions in the east, including several Panzer divisions capable of executing concentrated offensive operations. The speed and efficiency of this recovery astounded Allied intelligence, which had meticulously tracked movements and reinforcements across German territory. Patton and his commanders faced a sobering reality. The pause in early September, forced largely by fuel shortages and logistical planning, had given the Germans invaluable time. What could have been an unstoppable advance to the Rhine, potentially ending the war months earlier, had been transformed into a grinding series of engagements against fortified positions. The Third Army's initial momentum, which had threatened the very heart of Germany, was lost. The Allied forces now had to contend with newly entrenched positions, minefields, barbed wire, artillery emplacements, and well-coordinated German defensive strategies. The strategic advantage that had been achieved by rapid movement through France and Belgium had been partially neutralized, demonstrating how critical time and logistics are in modern mechanized warfare. December's Ardennes offensive further illustrated the consequences of this pause. The Germans struck with surprise and intensity, aiming to split the Allied lines, capture key supply depots, and force a negotiated settlement. Initial attacks caught Allied units off guard, leading to chaotic engagements and high casualties, particularly among American forces unprepared for the sudden concentrated Panzer assault. More than 80,000 American casualties were inflicted in the first weeks of the offensive, emphasizing that the delay in Patton's advance had profound human and strategic costs. Yet, the very existence of the Ardennes operation was contingent on the German ability to recover in the months after September. Had Patton reached the Rhine in mid-September, the Germans would not have had sufficient time, reserves, or cohesion to launch such a massive counteroffensive. The Third Army, now facing the realities of this fortified and prepared German defense, adapted its strategy. Rather than sweeping advances, operations became systematic, focusing on clearing fortified positions and methodically advancing through heavily defended terrain. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters rather than tens of kilometers, a stark contrast to the rapid momentum of September. The shift highlighted a fundamental lesson in operational planning. The difference between strategic opportunity and strategic pause can determine the entire course of a campaign. Logistics, supply lines, and timing are as decisive as combat strength, and even the most formidable offensive can falter if operational tempo is interrupted. From the German perspective, September had been nothing short of miraculous. Commanders who had witnessed the near collapse of their forces were given a second chance to restore order and create a defensive bulwark. Troops were reorganized, new recruits integrated, Panzer divisions rebuilt, and fortifications reinforced. The psychological impact on German forces was significant. They went from facing total disintegration to regaining a sense of control and operational capability. The Ardennes counteroffensive was the culmination of these efforts, demonstrating the interplay between time, preparation, and opportunity. The German leadership's ability to capitalize on this gift of time underscores the unpredictable nature of warfare, where human decisions, logistics, and chance converge to shape outcomes. For the Americans, the pause served as a harsh but invaluable lesson in operational management. It reinforced the importance of supply lines, the dangers of overextension, and the critical role of logistics in sustaining momentum. Patton's Third Army, although temporarily slowed, eventually overcame the fortified positions, pushing German forces back and resuming the march toward Germany's heartland. The victory, however, came at a higher cost than it might have, and the delay extended the timeline of the war, increasing casualties and complicating post-war planning. Historians analyzing this period consistently point to the September pause as one of the most significant what-if moments of World War II. Interviews and memoirs from German commanders, including von Rundstedt, Blumentritt, Westphal, and Jodl, consistently affirmed that the Third Army's momentum could not have been stopped by German military strength alone. The halt in September was a decision forced by operational limits, not enemy resistance, and it inadvertently provided the Germans with the breathing room to reorganize and stage one of their final offensives. The strategic and human consequences of this pause cannot be overstated. The extension of the war led to additional casualties on both sides, delayed liberation for occupied territories, and influenced the timing and scope of post-war reconstruction. Ultimately, the events of September through December 1944 underscore a timeless lesson in military history. Opportunity and timing are as crucial as strength and strategy. The Third Army's halt allowed Germany to restore its forces, launch a temporary counteroffensive, and create a more protracted, brutal struggle. Patton's leadership, brilliant and relentless, had to adapt to this new reality, demonstrating the flexibility required of commanders facing the dynamic interplay of logistics, enemy action, and circumstance. The pause, while frustrating, also illustrated the unpredictability of war and the profound impact that seemingly minor operational decisions can have on the course of history. In conclusion, the halt of Patton's Third Army in September 1944 was not a failure of leadership, nor a triumph of German military genius. It was a moment where logistics, operational limits, and circumstance intersected, altering the course of the campaign and creating consequences that would reverberate through the Ardennes, the Rhine, and ultimately the conclusion of the war. The human cost of this pause was heavy, the strategic lessons enduring, and the historical debate about what might have been continues to this day. For students of military history, it serves as a reminder that war is shaped as much by timing, resources, and decision-making as it is by courage, tactics, and combat prowess. If you enjoyed this detailed exploration of Patton's campaign, the German recovery, and the Battle of the Bulge, don't forget to like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more in-depth World War II history content. Your support helps bring more stories like this to light. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.